In Passmore Street, SW1, there is a warm little world called the Fox and Hounds. The landlady is Diane. She's a wonderful woman with a capacity to listen even to dull stories, so naturally lots of actors go there. And it was in that snug little world that I was told that if I were to go to Ebury Street the following morning at 7:15 and stand outside number 182, where the young Mozart had written his first symphony, I would meet a man called Arthur Cordes, who was in the way of needing a labourer. In a state of deep apprehension and joyous depression, I loitered at the gate to Mozart's place at 7:05 and waited. Arthur Cordes came right on time, took me to the site, which was about 3 doors from Wolfgang's place, and gave me a cup of tea and a piece of bread pudding about the size of a half-brick. And so I set to work as a builder's labourer. Arthur was my master, and a good one too. He was as jolly as Mr. Fezziwig, though whether he could dance I never did find out. Fuelled by sweet tea and bread pudding, I set to work happy in the thought that nobody knew where I was or even cared. The work was so hard that it soothed me. I was shattered at the end of the day, and that helped me to get through the nights. Some years before this, I had been in The Millionairess with Maggie Smith for the BBC's Play of the Month series. It was directed by Bill Slater, and all those years later, sleeping on a mattress in Bourne Street, Pimlico, I wrote him a desperate letter. I pointed out to him that there had to be some sort of part for me in the huge series and serials department of the BBC. I wrote the letter on a lonely Sunday night. The letter was posted on Monday morning on my way past Mozart's house to pick up my bread pudding and start work for Arthur Cordes, who was now a friend. It reached Bill Slater's office on Tuesday after he had left for a meeting with Barry Letts, a senior producer responsible for Doctor Who. John Pertwee had given up the part of Doctor Who, and Barry Letts and other colleagues were having casting meetings to find a replacement. That was the first coincidence. Now, the reason that Bill was attending this meeting was that in the next week he was to become the head of the department. It was considered by Barry, who has exquisite manners, that the future boss should be in on the discussions to recast Doctor Who. At the meeting, Bill was asked if he had any strong views on who the new man should be. He had none. Another meeting was fixed for the next day. Bill had a late meeting with other people that day, and then after some drinks with colleagues, he went to his office, picked up my letter, and went home to Mary Webster, his wife. Bill told me he was actually getting into bed when he glanced at my poor begging letter. He read it to Mary Webster. The time was 11:15 p.m. in Great Titchfield Street. Bill and Mary thought I would be a good choice for Doctor Who, and Mary said, "Call him now." And he did. And I answered. Bill said he'd just read my letter, and would I like to come and see him at the TV centre the next evening at about 6:30. He was not specific, and I didn't care. All I wanted was to be seen by someone who could help me. I was on time. Bill Slater was waiting for me and took me up to the office of the head of drama, Sean Sutton. Barry Letts was there. So there I was with 3 very nice men who chatted and laughed at my jokes and seemed very pleased to see me. "We've got an idea, you see, Tom," said Bill after nearly an hour. "Do you think you could come back tomorrow?" I was quite willing to spend the night outside the office if they'd wanted it, but I thought that would have betrayed anxiety, so I went home. The next day, I fled the site at 5:15 and rushed to Bourne Street for a swill and a change of clothes. I was a bit late, but Bill said not to worry, and up we went to Sean Sutton's office again. Like the night before, Barry Letts was there. They sat me down and asked me how I was, and then fell into an interesting silence. Sean nodded to Bill, who looked towards Barry, who said, "Tom, we'd like you to be the next Doctor Who. What do you think?" I have to remind you that in those days Doctor Who was a very big job in television. I have to remind you that I was living on the smell of an oil rag and bread pudding. "Well," said Barry, "what do you say?" All I could do was nod. You know how it is with pleasure. One nod led to another nod, and soon I couldn't stop nodding, and they laughed kindly. We all shook hands, and Barry said, "There's just one thing, Tom." My heart skidded. Barry said, "We'd like to delay the announcement for a while. Do you think you could sit on the news for 10 days? I nodded, and then they all started nodding and smiling, and off I went into the darkness of Wood Lane, heavy with the great news that had to be kept secret. On the tube I kept wanting to nudge somebody, anybody, and tell her the news, but I didn't dare. It was an amazing few days. Dear Arthur, who brought me bread pudding made by his Babs, would have loved to hear what I had to say, but I had promised Barry Letts, and I was terrified that something might spoil my good fortune. The first wages were not all that good, but I didn't know that. I accepted it and blew it as fast as I could. The odd thing was that as soon as I got some dosh, the poor dodged me. The only people I met were those who were well fixed. I couldn't tell the difference, and blew it. Suddenly the crowd who'd found me boring now found me fascinating. Like another Tony Lumpkin, I bought the drinks and sang out of tune and still got the applause. I also got the clap. Ponces often do that. They take your drink and food, share your cabs and give you crabs. But that's low life. That's the dogma. Give me what you've got and I'll listen, and if you play your cards right, I'll infect you. And like lots of victims, I was grateful. But that's later. Anyway, the day was fixed and I was to say to Arthur that I needed a whole day off to go to the BBC about this little job I'd mentioned. I went to my friend Ted Whitehead and asked him if he'd like to come to the BBC for the enthronement of the new Doctor Who. Ted said he'd come, and on the great morning he and I were whisked, stars always get whisked, into the Bridge Lounge to await the presentation of the new Doctor to the waiting press. I wore a white suit and a Peruvian sweater and a tie painted by some poor, exploited Atahualpa or other. Barry Letts led me forth for the presentation. Not since I'd faced the foreign press in Los Angeles for Nicholas and Alexandra had I felt so well. There was clapping, there was flashing of cameras, and then more clapping, and I desperately hoped it would never stop, and it didn't for quite a while. I whirled and posed and smiled and looked alien, and the more they gasped, the more I did it, and so it went on. At last, I had ceased to exist, and that was a great feeling. Everyone wanted to touch me, and I wanted them to touch me too, and they did, and it was just marvellous. Oh, yes. The second edition of the Standard carried a picture of me on the front page. Oh, bliss. Fuck off, anonymity. Hello, everybody. And, of course, Arthur and the chaps on the site would have got the paper and wouldn't be expecting to see me again. Next morning, I arrived on the site as usual. The men were amazed. Arthur kept looking at me and laughing, and the day passed in a cloud of madness. I asked Arthur if I could leave a bit early, and could we all have a drink at 5:30. Yes, he said, and off I rushed to the bank, and then to Partridge's in Sloane Street for little goodies to go with the booze. It was all too much. The men were so kind as well as totally incredulous. They kept shaking their heads and then shaking my hand. Somebody turned up from the Daily Express and asked if we could all be there the next morning for pictures, hods and shovels at the ready. And the joy increased as the fellows realized that they too were in on the madness, and that people wanted to look at them and talk to them as well. We all stood in a line with our tools at hand and obeyed the snapper's every whim. The next morning we were all famous. A lovely picture and a very warm little article too. At lunchtime I shook hands and swore eternal friendship with everyone, and full of tears and good resolution I tottered off past Mozart's house, and I never saw them again. I was Doctor Who now. I was an alien. Playing Doctor Who came as a great surprise to me. I had no idea I would enjoy it so much. All that was required of me was to be able to speak complete gobbledygook with conviction. It was all so easy, because all my life I had been taught nonsense by priests and teachers. It was no problem for me to say that I came from another world and could go back and forth in time in my emphysemic old TARDIS, which was bigger on the inside than it was on the outside. Problem? For me, who had believed in guardian angels and was convinced that pigs were possessed by devils after their New Testament encounter with God's Son? It was a doddle, and I loved it. Terry Sampson organised visits to schools all over the country, and I was taken to visit dying children in the hope that my presence might rouse the poor things. I cannot say what anguish this was, as distraught parents would watch as I repeated what they had told me might rouse their child. It never did, but they insisted I try, and were so sweet even in my constant failure. They would thank me for trying. Thank me. It meant that I never stopped being the doctor. The endless enthusiasm of the children and parents fueled us all. Once, when I was in a closed ward for children, an 11-year-old boy who hadn't spoken for nearly a year came out of his secret world and embraced me very cheerfully. The doctors and nurses were so pleased. And so I was able to avoid my real self during all these activities and pursue the fantasy life of the benevolent alien. And being able to escape the despised self kept me in good spirits. The welcome and smiles came from all levels of the audience. There was no hostility anywhere. I think this was because the character I was didn't threaten anyone. It was all rather dotty, and I became used to being called doctor by real doctors and nurses, and the pleasure the children derived from all this was enough to make me happy. It was no great sacrifice, I can tell you. Nowadays, I escape into the world of Charles Dickens. What a pecksniff I might have been. But any of the great hypocrites would do me. There is a serene quality in a fine hypocrite that I greatly admire. I don't think it's possible to be a frenzied hypocrite. That wouldn't do at all. There's nearly always a sublime self-assurance to a good hypocrite, don't you think? Hypocrites are not prone to self-doubt. I always imagine that great hypocrites have no interior life at all. What you see is what they are. All good actors have a touch of the hypocrite. I think I was born to be a hypocrite, all exterior and hollow, but wanting to amuse. Hypocrites can be very generous too, so long as the world is watching. I'd like to specialize in them. Bounderby, Sapsy, Fosco and Chadband. Oh, and Turveydrop, that master of deportment. He'd be another good one. I'll get my agent onto it. Perhaps I could do a one-man show of hypocrites, and we'll call it Hypocrites, with Tom Baker. For more than 6 years I left myself and floated about as a hero. Nobody was allowed to smoke or swear near me. I always sat down if I could, for the children were always a bit alarmed at my height. Once, walking along Westbourne Grove, I was surrounded by a group of ecstatic children, and for 10 minutes or so I entertained them and their teacher. As they went off waving affectionately to me, I noticed a young Greek shopkeeper watching me. He said, "Everybody knows you, Doctor," and I was thinking as I watched you with those children, who knows me? Who knows Dimitri? When I walk down the street, nobody knows Dimitri. No children hold out their arms to me. And he was right, and I shall never forget it. Once I was a hero. Under June Hudson's influence, my costume became more and more operatic. Some people said that my performance became more and more operatic too, and they were probably right. Anyway, June and I became friends. We still are. She also designed lovely things for Lalla Ward too. Lalla was marvellously witty and so good to be with that I fell in love with her. Later we got married, and were happy for a little while. I have terrific memories of Lalla. There were 4 producers during my time as the Doctor. Barry Letts, who had made the decision to employ me in the first place, followed by Philip Hinchcliffe, followed by Graham Williams, and finally John Nathan Turner. John was very knowledgeable about the programme and was naturally keen to influence it. I was now finding the work a little arduous, and the new characters who'd been brought in didn't stimulate me at all. It was time to go. But the thought of leaving after 178 episodes, the equivalent of 45 feature films, filled me with apprehension. I pretended to be philosophical about it, and I really did think that I could beat the problem of being typecast, but I couldn't. I think it's very common for actors to feel that they have died when a job comes to an end, and sometimes they lose confidence too as they are forced back into real life and lines that haven't been written for them. In my case, real life was something I was only very tenuously connected to. Lalla Ward swiftly realized that domestic life did not nourish me at all, and she very kindly made it easy for me to escape it. We decided in a very gentle discussion to go our different ways and see what happened. We never saw each other again. But the hardest thing of all was to be aware that I was no longer a hero to children. I suffered dreadful withdrawal symptoms. Now that new parts are hard to find and old parts begin to wither, I escape into books. Recently I have been in the world of Ivy Compton Burnett. It has been a great comfort to me, and has helped to pass the time. As I finished Husbands and Wives, I suddenly realized I was 62 years old. Next thing, I will go back to Charles Dickens. That should use up a good slice of my remaining span, and keep me from sad thoughts. So after 7 years of adulation, my future seemed bleak. Go back to the identity that one has been struggling to escape from all one's life? What kind of a fate is that?